The sound of galloping hooves trampled across the misty fields, villages blazed in the night, and cries of anguish echoed through the forests of Lorraine. This was France in the early 15th century, a kingdom torn apart by war, division, and despair. The 100 Years' War, a prolonged conflict between the royal houses of France and England that had begun in 1337, still showed no signs of ending by the early 1400s. Nearly a century had passed, yet the sword had not left the warrior's hand. Both sides claimed to be the rightful heir to the French throne. Meanwhile, it was the common people who bore the brunt of the suffering. In France, King Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, was afflicted with mental illness at times. Failing to recognize even his own wife and children, he was utterly incapable of ruling. The kingdom was split in two. The north, controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. The south remained only partially loyal to his son, the Dauphin Charles, a king in name, not yet officially recognized. In 1415 the English, under the leadership of King Henry III, won a glorious victory at the Battle of Agincourt, slaughtering thousands of French knights and crushing the morale of the people. The treaties that followed only made things worse. Henry V was declared heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. When both Henry V and Charles VI died, within a few years of each other, the French crown was claimed by Henry VI, a newborn child in England. Dauphin Charles, meanwhile, wandered his small southern domain, with too few troops and even less faith from the people. At that time, the city of Orléans, one of the last strongholds still loyal to Charles, was under siege by the English. If it fell, nearly all of France would be lost. Amid this darkness, with no rightful king, no hope of victory, and no more belief in miracles, a 17-year-old girl from a small village stepped forward. She was not a noble, bore no royal blood, commanded no army, and had never studied the art of war. But she carried something the entire kingdom desperately needed: faith. Joan, the girl from Domremy, believed she had been sent by God to save France. Domremy, a small village in eastern France, nestled peacefully in the Meuse Valley, was largely forgotten by the war, though not entirely spared from roaming bands of pillagers. There, around the year 1412, a baby girl was born into the family of Jacques d'Arc, a relatively well-off farmer. They named her Jeanne. History would remember her as Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She grew up among the fields, helping her mother with farm work, milking cows, spinning wool, and attending church regularly like many other village girls. No one could have imagined that this gentle, devout girl would one day ride into battle, lead armies, break sieges, and challenge both crown and church. Joan was illiterate and had never studied theology, but from a young age she was known for her deep piety. Villagers recalled that she prayed earnestly, attended church frequently, and showed a rare compassion for others. But when she was 13 years old, something extraordinary began to happen. One summer afternoon, while in her garden, Joan heard a voice. Then came a brilliant light, so dazzling she could not look directly at it. She believed it was Saint Michael, the archangel who commands the armies of heaven. Later she said that Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret also appeared to her. They had a divine mission for her, to save France and ensure the Dauphin Charles was crowned king. At first, Joan was frightened and dared not tell anyone, but the voices kept returning with growing urgency. Deep inside, she knew this was no hallucination, no fantasy. This was a command from God. Just imagine a 16-year-old girl living in an age when women had no voice, believing that she had been chosen by God to lead an army. She had never held a weapon, never left her village, yet she decided to leave home and go see the king, an act that seemed utterly mad to everyone. Her first destination was Vaucouleurs, a nearby town, under the control of the Dauphin Charles. There she sought an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. When she told him God had chosen her, he burst out laughing. "Go home, you crazy girl," was his first reaction. But Joan didn't give up. She returned again and again. The townspeople who had witnessed her piety and courage began to support her. Gradually, even Baudricourt was swayed, not only by her persistence, but also by a strange prophecy. Joan had predicted the French defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, also known as the Battle of the Herrings. The news would later confirm her words. In 1429, Joan, just 17 years old, was finally granted permission to leave Vaucouleurs and travelled to meet the Dauphin Charles at Chinon, more than 500 kilometres away. The journey was long and dangerous, crossing territories tightly controlled by the English and the Burgundians, where every bridge and town posed a threat. Joan cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothes, and rode like a warrior, accompanied by a few loyal escorts. With unshakable faith and a mysterious charisma, she made it through, carrying a single message: God has sent me. He wills that you be crowned. At the castle in Chinon, Charles's court was torn and uncertain. The Dauphin, whose bloodline and competence were both questioned, thought Joan might be a joke, but he decided to test her. In a crowded hall, Charles disguised himself as a courtier, hiding among his nobles to see if she could identify him. But when Joan entered, she did not hesitate. She walked straight up to him and knelt. "My lord," she said, "I am sent by God. You are the rightful King of France." The room fell silent. Charles, the man who trusted no one, began to believe that this girl was no ordinary peasant. Not only had she known what no one could have told her, but she possessed something no one else at court had, a strength that defied explanation, the strength of faith. When Dauphin Charles first met Joan, he did not immediately grant her any power. A young girl from the countryside, claiming to hear voices from heaven, how could he trust her enough to hand over an army for her to command? So Charles sent her to Poitiers, where theologians would investigate and examine her. For weeks, clerics and scholars questioned Joan, pressing her about the voices, her faith, and her theological knowledge. They tried every tactic to catch her in a contradiction. But Joan never wavered. She said she was not a priest, not a preacher, only a tool of God, and her mission was simple: to save France. The scholars found no grounds to accuse her of heresy. After much debate, they gave her permission to act. In April 1429, King Charles, still hesitant, agreed to give Joan a small army to help lift the siege of Orleans. But he didn't just give her a few hundred soldiers, he gave her a symbol. Joan was given shining armor, a war horse, a sacred sword, and, most importantly, a white banner bearing the image of Jesus Christ and 2 angels. That banner would become her emblem throughout the campaign, flying high amid the spears and war cries. Joan was not a military commander in the traditional sense. She didn't draw up battle plans or lecture on strategy. But what she brought was something even more vital than tactics: faith. When she arrived at Orleans, the city had been under siege by the English for months. The people were exhausted, the soldiers demoralized, the commanders divided. The French had tried and failed repeatedly to break the siege. But with Joan's arrival, everything changed. She entered the city via the Loire River, greeted by cheering crowds. People clung to the ramparts just to catch a glimpse of her, calling her the Holy Maiden, the Angel of Deliverance. She rode a white horse, holding her banner, her eyes ablaze like fire from the heavens. The next day, Joan toured the walls, surveyed the English positions, and roused the soldiers. She didn't speak in lofty terms. She simply said, "We do not fight alone. God is fighting with us." Then she went to war. The battle to reclaim Orleans didn't happen in a single night. One by one, English fortifications were attacked. Saint-Lô, Augustins, Boulevard. Joan led from the front, not wielding a sword, but raising her banner high. When the troops hesitated, she rode straight into the trenches, urging them to press forward. At Tourelle, the final and most crucial English stronghold south of the river, the fighting was fiercest. As she led the charge up a scaling ladder, Joan was struck by an arrow that pierced through her shoulder. She fell, blood soaking her armor. People thought she was dead. But just hours later, as the battle stalled, she returned to the field, still, bandaged and bloodied, still holding her banner, shouting, "Forward, for God has given us this city!" The soldiers roared like madmen. Their spirits reignited. They charged as if by miracle, driving the English out of Tourelle. On May 8th, 1429, the English fully retreated from Orleans. Joan had done what seasoned generals had failed to do for months. She was not the architect of the victory, but she was the flame that set it ablaze. All of France seemed to awaken. From a defeated nation, the people suddenly raised their heads for the first time in years. They hadn't just won, they had found a symbol, a young girl who carried light and extraordinary courage. People began to believe if she truly was a messenger from God, then France was not yet dead. After the victory at Orleans, Joan of Arc's name spread across France like a beacon in the night. She was no longer an unknown peasant girl. She had become a symbol of hope, a guide through the darkness, the Maid of God. But to Joan herself, the mission was not yet complete. For the voices she had heard still commanded her to see the Dauphin Charles crowned king at Reims, the traditional site of coronation for French monarchs since the days of Clovis. But at that time, Reims lay deep within territory controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. Reaching it would mean crossing a northern region riddled with danger. The royal commanders hesitated. They believed the march north was reckless, even impossible, but Joan, with unwavering faith, declared, "It is God who leads us. If he wills it, no army can stand in our way." In June 1429, the royal army began its journey, not merely a military campaign, but an armed pilgrimage. Joan led the way, armoured on horseback, still carrying her white banner with the two angels. The army was not large, but their faith surged like a flood. Then something strange began to happen. Many towns and fortresses along the way, whether neutral or Burgundian, surrendered without a fight. The people opened their gates and welcomed. The army, like liberators, they brought bread, water, and wine to the roadsides, singing and hailing Joan as the virgin saviour of France. Without swords or spears, it was the hearts of the people that opened the path. At Troyes, one of the 4 key cities on the road to Reims, the garrison shut the gates against them. The French commanders debated retreat, but Joan rode forward, ordered her men to encamp and light fires, sending smoke billowing into the sky. By the next day, the city surrendered. The local clergy exclaimed, "Surely God is with this girl." After Troyes, Chalons and other cities followed suit. It seemed no one wished to oppose the girl who carried light from heaven. On July 16, 1429, the army reached the gates of Reims. Though loyal to the Burgundians, the city's leaders saw resistance was futile. The sacred city, witness to the coronations of Clovis, Charlemagne, and countless kings, opened its gates to welcome the Dauphin Charles. The next morning, July 17th, the coronation took place in the great cathedral of Reims, one of the most magnificent events in French history. Joan stood beside Charles throughout the ceremony. When the Archbishop of Reims anointed him with holy oil and placed the crown upon his head, the church bells rang out, mingled with cheers from the crowds outside. Charles was no longer the Dauphin. He was now Charles VII, the rightful King of France. Joan knelt down, tears streaming down her face, and whispered through sobs, "My lord, my task is complete." No one in that cathedral would ever forget the sight, a girl clad in silver armour, sunburnt hair, kneeling in a beam of coloured light filtering through the stained glass, like an angel on earth. She asked for no reward, no titles, no glory. All she wanted was to return home to the peaceful fields of Domremy. But fate would not allow it. Though the king had been crowned, the war was far from over. The English still held Paris, still controlled Normandy, and still harboured ambitions to dethrone the Valois line. Joan, who had just raised a king, now faced a greater challenge, convincing the royal court to act, and so the seeds of tragedy were quietly sown. With the coronation at Reims, Joan had fulfilled the sacred mission given to her by the voices from heaven, but France had not. Charles VII wore the crown, but he did not yet hold real power over the entire kingdom. The English still occupied Paris, the heart of the country, and Burgundy remained the traitorous ally conspiring with foreign invaders. Joan understood that without action, the victory at Orléans and the coronation would be fleeting moments. She did not stop. Right after the ceremony at Reims, she urged King Charles to march on Paris, hoping to seize the capital while the people's spirits were still high. But Charles, weak, hesitant, and surrounded by conservative advisers, began to waver. While the king hesitated, Joan once again took the lead herself. In August 1429, Joan led a campaign close to Paris. Along the way, she continued to liberate towns like Soissons and Saint-Denis. The people cheered her arrival. Statues of the Virgin, Mary lining the streets, were decorated as if for a holy feast. But this battlefield was unlike Orleans. Paris was a massive fortress, heavily guarded by the English and Burgundians, and this time Joan no longer had full backing from the king. Yet she resolved to attack on September 8, 1429, on the feast, Day of the Virgin Mary. Joan launched an assault on the Saint-Honoré gate of Paris. Under a hail of arrows and boiling oil, she led the French troops, her white banner fluttering. The battle raged from morning till evening. Joan was wounded in the leg but refused to retreat. She insisted on bringing ladders to scale the walls, despite blood soaking her armor. Soldiers had to pull her out of the trenches. By day's end, an order came from Charles VII, retreat. Joan cried out in anguish. She could not understand why, at the moment of possibly taking Paris, the king would command a withdrawal. But she no longer had the power to decide. This was a turning point. After the failed Paris campaign, the royal court's faith in Joan began to falter. The nobles feared her growing fame. They resented that a peasant girl wielded more influence than generals and bishops. King Charles VII, though indebted to her for the throne, started to distance himself. He signed a truce with Burgundy, shelving all plans for further attacks. Joan, the warrior of faith and holy fire, was sidelined. But she did not stop. Despite losing royal support, Joan led a small army, continuing to liberate towns and villages along the Loire River. She said, "If the king will not act, then I will act instead." In May 1430, Joan reached Compiègne, a northern city under siege by Burgundy. She did not wait. She launched a bold raid to break the siege, aiming to strike the enemy camp by surprise and then withdraw. But fate had other plans. On May 23, 1430, as Joan and her small force attacked the Burgundian camp near Pont-l'Évêque, they initially succeeded, pushing back the enemy. But as they retreated toward the city gates, tragedy struck. The gates were closed before she could enter. Some historians believe that the city's Burgundian sympathizers deliberately shut the gates to trap her. Others think it was panic, but the outcome was the same. Joan was surrounded and captured by the enemy. The Burgundian troops took her prisoner as a spoil of war. Soon after, they sold her to the English for 10,000 livres, a huge sum at the time, as if buying the very light from heaven. Joan, the one who placed the king on the throne, who led a nation out of darkness, was now bound like a criminal. The English did not merely want to kill her, they wanted to destroy what she represented. Unable to try her as a prisoner of war, they staged a religious trial with the goal of proving she was a heretic, a witch, possessed by demons. For if Joan was a saint, then the English were invaders. If Joan was a heretic, then Charles VII's throne would lose all legitimacy. A modern witch hunt began where the trial was just a pretext to burn the symbol of France. Joan of Arc was taken to Rouen, a city then under English control, where the so-called heresy trial would be held. But this was no fair trial. There was no impartial jury, no defense counsel, no chance of pardon. The outcome had been predetermined. Joan would be found guilty. The English knew they couldn't simply execute her as a prisoner of war. They needed to destroy her as a heretic, to shatter the faith she had ignited across France. If Joan was sent by God, then her victories at Orléans were divine. But if she was a tool of the devil, then her triumphs were trickery, and Charles VII's coronation a spiritual fraud. The English didn't just need to kill a girl, they needed to kill a symbol. Presiding over the trial was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a Frenchman loyal to the English cause. Cauchon was charged with orchestrating Joan's condemnation under the pretense of religious authority. He assembled a tribunal of over 60 clergymen and scholars, most of whom were under English influence or pressure. The trial lasted from February to May of 1431. Every day Joan was dragged before the judges. She had no lawyer, no family, no advocate. She stood alone, and yet this 19-year-old peasant girl, uneducated and imprisoned, confounded the entire clerical council. They asked, "Are you certain that the voices you heard were from angels and not from demons?" Joan replied, "I know those voices as well as I know the voices of my parents. They come from heaven. No one can make me believe otherwise." They asked, "Do you believe God has chosen you?" Joan said, "If I am not, may God forgive me. But if I am, may I remain in his service until the end." The clergy couldn't trap her. They tried to lure her into theological missteps, questioning her on faith, doctrine, and scripture. But Joan, though unschooled, answered with a clarity that left many speechless. Once they asked, "Do you believe you are in a state of God's grace?" A dangerous question. Church teaching said no one could be certain of that. If Joan said yes, she would be guilty of arrogance. If no, she would imply guilt. Joan answered, "If I am not in God's grace, I pray he puts me there. If I am, I pray he keeps me in it." The room fell silent. One scholar later wrote, "It was an answer no one could refute, but brilliance could not save her." Eventually, after weeks of interrogation, threats, starvation, and isolation, Joan was coerced into signing a confession, a document she couldn't read, prepared by the council declaring that she repented, agreed to wear women's clothes, and renounced her voices. The English believed they had won. They read the sentence in public, not death, but life in prison. Yet only days later, Joan was found again in men's clothing and armour. Why? Accounts differ. Some say she was assaulted in prison and donned armour to protect herself. Others believe she was tricked. Her women's garments removed, leaving only male attire. Regardless, it gave the English what they needed. On May 29, 1431, the tribunal reconvened. Joan was declared a relapsed heretic, and the penalty was death. The next morning, May 30, Joan was brought to the old market square in Rouen. She did not weep. Pale but resolute, she faced the crowd. A priest asked her, "Are you afraid?" She nodded, then looked up and said, "I fear not death, but that I may not have fulfilled what God asked of me." At the stake, she requested a cross. A priest gave her a wooden one which she clutched to her chest. Then a bystander brought a crucifix from the nearby church and held it high so she could see it in her final moments. As the flames rose, people heard her cry out, "Jesus! Jesus!" Those were her final words. The English burned her body twice to ensure no relics remained. They then scattered her ashes in the Seine to erase her from history. But they failed. Joan's death did not extinguish her legacy. Instead, it immortalized her. 25 years later, a retrial was held in Paris. Many witnesses from Rouen testified that the original verdict was unjust, the proceedings fraudulent, and that Joan was truly a servant of God, not the devil. In 1456, she was posthumously declared innocent. In 1909, the Catholic Church beatified her. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as Sainte Jeanne d'Arc, patroness of France. Today, throughout France, statues, churches, and boulevards bear her name. From a shepherd girl in Domremy, she became a divine heroine of the nation, a young woman who dared to rise, armed only with her faith, and stand against kings, bishops, and empires. And though fire consumed her body, Joan's spirit would never die. Thank you for joining me on this inspiring journey through the story of Joan of Arc, a symbol of courage and unwavering faith. If you love fascinating historical stories and want to learn more about the great figures who shaped history, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell below so you never miss a new video. See you in the next one.